Good morning, 8th graders. It is Monday, January the 18th, and we are starting a lesson today on transitive verbs. If you were with me in 7th grade, then you will probably remember much of this, and you may even just be able to scroll through quickly just to pick up some of the points that maybe you have forgotten. So I'll try to keep this short and sweet, but did want to go over something so that if you're not quite sure about transitive verbs, you will be a little bit more comfortable after we're done. So if you look at your gray box, there are 4 different bullet points about the transitive verb, and I'm not sure if I've rewritten these kind of in my own words or not, but a transitive verb passes its action to a noun or pronoun in the sentence, and we'll talk about the different ways it can pass that action in just a minute. The transitive verb usually will pass its action to a direct object. Remember, the mom baked dad a cake, and in that case, the cake is getting the action of the verb. It's what's being baked. But a transitive verb with a direct object may also have an indirect object, or the transitive verb may pass its action back to the subject. And there's some clue things that I'll point out that'll help you to figure that out. So if you don't remember from last year, transitive verbs are verbs where you clearly can see the action in your head. Now, if you could see the action in your head, is it always a transitive verb? No, not always. But that's one kind of clue thing that you can do to reduce your possibilities of what it might be. If I have a sentence that says mom is nice, that verb is, you can't see that action in your head. That puts it in a whole different category. But if I have something like John raced with Dawn, you can see the racing happening, and you can see that action in your head. So words like is, are, was, were, they're usually linking or intransitive complete verbs, helping verbs, and so their chances are not going to be transitives. You can't see them in your head. So think about the action that you can actually see happening in your head, and that would be a transitive verb. Now, transitive itself, the word, you think of all the things where you could find the words or the trans, like transportation, transatlantic, transcommunication. All of those have something to do with movement and going across. And so you think about transportation, that's moving you to something. And so the transitive verbs are moving the action either to the direct object or back to the subject. Now, we've already talked about that many times there will be a direct object with your transitive verbs. And so if you see this action in your head, then you should automatically be asking the question that indicates a direct object. So in our sentence, mom baked a cake. Mom is the subject. What did she do? She baked. Baked what? And that's the question that we ask to determine if there's a direct object or not. So we can see the action in our head, and we can answer the question what or who to determine that there is a direct object. So always remember this sentence and pattern other sentences after it as you're trying to determine if there is a direct object or not. In a minute, we're going to actually look at how to diagram sentences that have an indirect object because many of these sentences can have an indirect object. So you've learned the process of diagramming a direct object. The subject goes in the first spot, God, and the God did what? He led. But then to get a direct object, what you do is you have this little straight up and down line. And in this case, we have 2 direct objects. God led who or what? He led Abraham and Sarah. So that's how you diagram. I think most of you are pretty clear on that and really don't have trouble with that. But here is a compound. Now, sometimes you can have a compound verb with 1 direct object, Or you could have two verbs with two different direct objects, and that's what we've got in this case. Lot chose the plains and pitched a tent. So Lot is our subject, but he did two different things. He chose and pitched. We can actually see the actions sort of with chose, definitely with pitched. But then you ask the questions after both of those verbs. Lot chose what? He chose the plains. Lot pitched what? He pitched a tent. And so that's how you do your compound. And again, always ask the question to see if there is a direct object that could come after each verb. Now, I promised you that I would show you how to do the indirect objects. You guys probably mostly know how to do this, but there's several examples. Father gave the boys a list. I don't see any other words in there, so I think that's probably the correct way to interpret that sentence. But Father gave what? Father gave list. Now, it might be easy to say, oh, well, Father gave the boys, and then get an incorrect direct object there. So ask first, Father gave what? And then if he gave it to someone, then that's the indirect object. And it gets diagrammed just like this, dropping off of the verb down in a similar fashion as a prepositional phrase would. The girls made father and mother gifts or a gift, and so we have it dropping down here because I have two, father and mother. Girls made what? Girls made gift. Now, if I said that sentence in a different way, the girls made a gift for father and mother, then it would not be an indirect object because it would be part of a prepositional phrase, for mother and father. So in that case, you would not put it in as an indirect object. And then the last one, mother prepared the family a meal. Mother prepared what meal? Who did she prepare it for? The family. So hopefully that clears up any confusion on how to do the indirect object. It's always going to drop down off the verb. So it's one of those consistent rules. You're going to drop the indirect object off the verb, not the direct object. Okay? All right. Now, you can change who receives the action in passive writing. Now, active writing is what we just saw, the transitive verb and the direct object. But sometimes it's the subject that gets the action. And so I could have a situation here. The example I gave you earlier, Mom baked Dad a cake. Cake is the direct object. Dad was the indirect object. And cake is receiving the action. But if I add in a helping verb or a to be verb, the cake was being baked by Mom, and that's right here in this window. I've added in was being baked. That whole thing is a verb phrase. This is called passive writing. When you add the is, are, was, were, it suddenly makes the writing passive. Sometimes you tend to write passively, and I will tell you to knock it off. I write passively and have to tell my own self to knock it off. It's okay, but it's not, to do it consistently. Probably it's not done that well. There are some writers that do it well. But anyway, it changes. The baked is back here. What was baked? The cake. The cake was being baked by Mom. The action has been passed back to the cake. So let me just tell you, if you see the words is, are, was, were, be, being, been, and it's attached to another verb, it's probably going to have the action being passed back to the subject. It's just how it works in passive writing. So if you see, if you look on page 264 of your book, there are some examples there. And if you look at the top of page 265, it says faithful ministers preach the gospel. Ministers preach what? Ministers preach the gospel. We can change that to passive writing and say the gospel is preached by faithful ministers, and then the action is passed back to gospel. If you look at how it's diagrammed in the second one, gospel is preached. But you're looking for that helping verb. So just make sure you remember that as you're looking through your class practice and your written exercises, that if you see is, are, was, were, be, being, been popping up with the verb, not necessarily by itself, but with another verb, then chances are you're passing your action to the subject. So let's take a look at our class practice, and what I'd like for you to do is we're going to do class practice A. It says read each transitive verb and name the substantive that receives the action. Substantive is just another word for noun. So we're going to determine whether the subject or the direct object is receiving the action. And if it's not a transitive verb, then you should write that as well. So I want you to take a few minutes. Just, this does not have to be turned in, so it doesn't have to be fancy schmancy, and just go through and real quick put what you think where the action is being passed. And when you are done, come back and I'll read through them and give you the answers. Okay, if you're back, the first one, John Bunyan boldly condemned the corruption in the Church of England and preached the gospel. In this situation, the verb is condemned. Condemned what? Corruption. We have a direct object. The second one, he preached what? The gospel, another direct object. Number 2, because of this, he was imprisoned. There's that clue word. Was pops in with the verb. Was imprisoned. He is going to get the action. So the subject gets the action in that case. Number 3, Bunyan likely did not imagine that he would remain there for 6 years. Did imagine that he would remain there for 6 years. Remember those clauses that we talked about a while? There's a big clause that he would remain there for 6 years. That's actually the direct object, and it's getting the action. During this imprisonment, he wrote several poems and his autobiography. Wrote what? Wrote poems. That's a direct object. Wrote what else? Autobiography, and that's a direct object. Number 5, for less than 1 week, Bunyan enjoyed living in freedom. Enjoyed what? Living in freedom. There's a gerund, and that would be your direct object. On Sunday morning, Bunyan and several other worshippers were arrested. There's that am, is, was, were popping in. Were arrested. Therefore, Bunyan is getting the action and is the subject. Same with worshippers. Bunyan and several other worshippers were arrested. So worshippers is also a subject that gets the action. Bunyan's most famous book, The Pilgrim's Progress, was penned during this prison stay. There's that am, is, was, were. Was penned. That means book is getting the action, the subject. 6 years later, the Declaration of Indulgence granted freedom to hundreds of persecuted Christians. Granted what? Freedom, direct object. So the action is in the direct object. Number 9, this time Bunyan's freedom lasted for 3 years. We have the word lasted there. For 3 years is a prepositional phrase. Freedom is the subject. There's really nothing that we can pass that action back to because there's not an is, are, was, were in there. So this one's actually not transitive. Finally, number 10, Bunyan wrote 22 books and many tracts. Wrote what? Wrote books, direct object, and tracts is the second direct object. Hopefully that helped to clear that up a little bit and make it a little bit more doable when you do your homework. So if you have questions, please ask on Wednesday, and I will plan to see you then.